All right, what's up, everyone? We are back, and the Senate just confirmed the best Fed chairman in American history. I'm excited about it. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on. So Kevin Warsh was confirmed by the Senate as the next chairman of the Federal Reserve by a vote of 51-45, mostly along party lines. John Fetterman joined the Republicans to confirm Mr. Warsh. So Warsh isn't exactly an Austrian. He's not, an abolish the Fed kind of guy. He's a reform the Fed kind of guy, which is unfortunately the best word to get. I know most of you guys are like, oh man, but we want to destroy the Fed. We want to burn it to the ground and salt the earth. Yeah, I know. But baby steps. Incrementalism is what the left is so good at. That's how they've achieved so much of, or so many of their goals in the last decades, and we could probably learn a little something from them, a little patience, little incrementalism. So let's meet Kevin Warsh. He's a guy, I don't want to represent his views. His views aren't my own, so let's just listen to him. Let's hear this guy speak for himself. The first one we're going to listen to here is him at the Hoover Institute, which I think he's a member of. I read he went to Stanford and then Harvard. So he's an educated guy, if that means anything to you. Here we go. Let's listen to Kevin Warsh.
Worse. Yes, well, this might upset part of your audience, Peter. So this is a trigger warning. This is what people like you and I do on campus. I believe this administration inherited a mess, a fiscal and monetary mess, and it is incumbent on the administration to get out of it. No one said it would be easy. We didn't get into this mess overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight. To make the numbers you said somewhat easier.
Sorry, just pause it right here. It's just nice to see a Federal Reserve chairman at this point. This was taped like 10 months ago or something, so he didn't know he was going to be Fed chair yet. But it is just nice to hear the now Fed chairman admit there's a problem. Because that's one of the biggest issues with these guys who end up getting onto the board of governors is they just think everything's fine. They're there to maintain the status quo, all that crap that we. But this guy, he does acknowledge there's a problem, which is the first step to solving it. So here we go.
Here, I think to understand, we were paying about $1 billion in interest expense every day, the day before COVID. We're now paying more than $3 billion per day in interest expense. None of that's going to strengthen the military or help the least well-off among us. That is being squandered away.
$3 billion in interest expense a day. I didn't know that statistic. I knew it was a lot, but $3 billion a day. That kind of tells you why we're so angry here, why we're so mad at these politicians that completely sold us out, and then all the previous Fed chairmen and the board of governors, all these people that have just pillaged our country. $3 billion in interest a day. It's insane. No country can recover from that. We are not going to dig ourselves out of that hole. So let's listen to Kevin, and he's going to infuriate us even more here.
So what do I suggest? As you pointed out, and as you and I have discussed, but I'm not sure the economics profession believes this, there are two monetary policy instruments. One is setting of interest rates, right, and the other is this money we keep talking about. We call it QE, we call it the central bank's balance sheet. If we would run the printing press a little quieter, we could then have lower interest rates. Because what we're doing right now is we have all this money that's being flooded into the system, which causes inflation to be above target. That's the $7 trillion balance sheet you're talking about, an order of magnitude larger than when I joined the Fed. And at the same time, you have another monetary policy instrument, and that's interest rates. They don't work perfectly together. They're not perfect substitutes for each, but they're both monetary policy. And too many that are in the central banking business say, no, that balance sheet has nothing to do with monetary policy. Well, if it did when you were growing it, it should have something to do with the conduct of monetary policy when it's going the other direction. I think we have to be honest about these two instruments. And because I believe that growing the real economy is the more important piece for revenue, for fairness, for efficiency and growth. Because you have higher inflation caused by the bigger balance sheet, we want to shrink that. We can't do it.
So just to make a little sense of what he's saying here is that since the Federal Reserve has printed so much money and just stuffed it into the economy, they've had to artificially lower interest rates in order for the government to keep printing all the money. Because what happens is if Congress deficit spends, what the Treasury does is issue bonds. The Fed buys those bonds and then loans money to the big banks at artificially low rates. If the Fed wasn't doing that, interest rates would skyrocket because the Fed has such a big balance sheet because the country's $40 trillion in debt. People wouldn't buy those government bonds at the low rates they do if the Fed wasn't doing it. So what he's saying here is, hey, if we, cut down on how much the government's printing here, interest rates would just come down naturally because people would have more trust in the government bonds, which is the right mentality. The more we can shrink the Fed, again, the closer we are to abolishing the Fed. We're not going to just blow up the Fed with its $7 trillion balance sheet. But if we can shrink it smaller and smaller and smaller, then by the time it gets back down to the size when Kevin Warsh was on the board of governors in, I think he said 2007, he got the call, when the Fed's balance sheet was $700 billion, it'd be a lot easier to get rid of the Fed if it was 10 times smaller. So that's what he's saying here is, hey, let's stop printing so much money. Then the interest rates will naturally come down.
But overnight, we want the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve to come to some accord, much like the Treasury and the Federal Reserve came to in 1951. Who's responsible for what? Who's going to be managing interest rates? The Federal Reserve. Who's going to be handling fiscal accounts? The Treasury Department. We have blurred these lines about who's responsible. And when a president comes to power, his Treasury Secretary should be responsible for as the fiscal authority, instead of blurring that over to the Federal Reserve, which only brings politics to the Federal Reserve, and I would say interrupts their normal, ordinary course. In my judgment, we should be shrinking the central bank balance sheet, taking the Fed out of these markets, unless and until there's a crisis. And in so doing, you'd have less inflation that way. You and I might call that a practical monetarism. I think that's what our intellectual heirs might be thinking about, intellectual teachers might be thinking about. And in so doing, you might actually be able to pull off lower interest rates, which matter more to the real economy than the balance sheet.
All right. And that's what we want to be hearing out of the Federal Reserve Chairman. Let's grow the real economy. Let's stop monkeying with interest rates. Let's stop, holding interest rates artificially low, and let's grow the real economy. That's what we want to hear out of a Fed chairman. A lot of what we've been doing recently is just, a bunch of nonsense, making sure that we can float all the big banks, making sure that Congress can still borrow as cheaply as possible. What Jerome Powell has done with his Federal Reserve has just been ridiculous. He has grown the Federal Reserve, and it seems like Kevin Warsh is going to break that trend, hopefully. I really hope that ends up being the case, and he sticks true to a lot of this stuff, because he seems like a reformer. He seems like somebody who's smart and truly believes that the Federal Reserve is not living up to its purpose, and we're going to see a little bit more in this next video as well. And sorry, this one, it's kind of a grainy video, but it's really just him sitting there talking. So it's the audio we care much more about. And I will bring you guys back in. Okay, here we go.
Witness this massive surge in fiscal spending over the last 5 years, over the last 15, is your central bank was subsidizing the cost of it. We were showing up, not just in crises, but in times of relative peace and prosperity and buying the bonds.
So that's the point that I just made. He's reiterating here that when we were not in a fiscal crisis. 2008 is kind of the first one he mentions where there was a lot of quantitative easing, meaning the government is buying a lot of bonds, and so they're buying government debt and then pushing cash into the system there. And what he's saying is that this here, let's just let him kind of
Spending over the last 5 years, over the last 15, is your central bank was subsidizing the cost of it. We were showing up, not just in crises, but in times of relative peace and prosperity. And
so what he's saying there is when we made it out of the 2008 crisis and we began the long recovery, then finished the long recovery, we should have stopped the quantitative easing there. We should have been pumping more and more money into the economy. But he's saying that's exactly what ended up happening, was that the Federal Reserve just kept pumping money into the economy. And then what that was doing was lowering the interest rates and allowing Congress to borrow it really cheaply and continue their deficit spending.
buying the bonds, hiding, camouflaging the full cost of spending. As we sit here today, the statistic is as of January, our federal government is spending 60% more money than the day before COVID, 5 years ago. I hardly remember that being a time of like an efficient, austere government, and we're spending 60% more, borrowing that money from people, some of whom don't like us, at prices we probably can't afford for projects we don't need, in a time that we're at full employment.
I love that line right there, that we're having to borrow from people that don't even like us, or for money we don't have, for projects we don't really need. Nothing sums up our government more perfectly than that line right there. Now, the Fed chairman that acknowledges that is going to be a big, big change. Just keep going.
The central bank has made that possible, not from a bad place, but from a good place. And in some sense, they've taken on these powers. This bigger central bank balance sheet crowds out the fiscal authorities, elected leaders like Chairman Hill, Treasury secretaries and governments, and has put them on the front pages. My view is we should be on the front pages when we're in real trouble. Otherwise, we should be back on page B12 of the newspaper. One final point. One of the consequences of this institutional drift into all sorts of business, climate policy and everything else, is the inflation that we've witnessed over the course of the last 5 years. Now, for most of us in the room, it hasn't been that big of a deal. We know it when we go to the grocery.
Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and talk about the inflation part, because that is like one of the biggest parts in this whole thing. Okay, we are back. Let's finish this and talk about inflation.
Store. We also own financial assets. Maybe we own some Bitcoin. 52% of our fellow Americans own no financial assets. They don't have equity in their house. They don't have an account at Schwab. They don't have an account at Coinbase. They're living off their W-2 income. And this surge in prices have destroyed them.
Okay, so his point there is that for people who have assets, inflation's not that bad of a thing. You can think of the boomer who bought their house in New York City for $10,000 in the 60s. Inflation seems really great to them. Their house is now worth millions. And they think, oh man, everything was so great. I bought all my stocks when, they were $1 a piece. I bought, back then, of course, you could buy a house for a couple times your salary. No big deal. Now, all of a sudden, inflation's run rampant. Nobody can afford to buy stocks. Most Americans that are under 30 can't afford to buy a house. So they don't, and we just said there, 52% of Americans, no assets. Inflation does not help them at all. So what you're going to get is this ever shrinking upper class, and then this widening gap here with the middle class and lower class declining, okay, in this kind of what they call the K-shaped economy. So you've got, the rich people getting a lot richer, and then the middle class and the working class getting a lot poorer. And the more inflation ramps up, the more that gap widens. If you can keep your money sound, keep inflation low, then you can bring those two sides together and build that big middle class. So that's his point there, is that the Federal Reserve and Congress have just exploded inflation, and it's not helping at least half of the country. Probably a lot more of the country is suffering. It's not like half the country is really doing great, because even if you own your own home and then inflation takes off, a lot of people can't access the equity in their home very cheaply because, again, interest rates have gone up recently. Or you're just saying, hey, it's just not worth it. I'm trying to put my kids through college. I've got to buy a new car. I've got to buy groceries all the time. And so what if my house, gained 10% in value? If it doesn't make up for all the expenses that are outpacing the growth of that asset. So that's what Kevin Warsh is talking about right here.
It's the most regressive tax any government could ever come up with. Imagine if we had a central bank that had been deadly focused on that. I think we wouldn't have taken a divided country, made it more divided. When we have a big balance sheet, we're asking for the inflation that came. And as a final point, my own judgment is the story that I hear from many of my peers was the inflation.
And then again, real quick, the big balance sheet, what he's talking about there, it is the Federal Reserve buying government bonds and pushing money into the economy. That's growing the balance sheet. It's just another term for saying they're printing money. They're causing inflation there. So let's listen to him continue.
Inflation, well, that's not really the central bank's fault. That's because of Putin and the pandemic. Nonsense. A change in prices happening is the story that I hear from many of my peers. Well, the inflation, well, that's not really the central bank's fault. That's because of Putin and the pandemic. Nonsense. A change in prices happens in a market economy because of shocks in the world. Changes in prices happen every day. That's not what inflation is. Inflation is when that change in prices become embedded. It's second and third order effects. And that's what's been the biggest harm to the country. My recommendation is a smaller balance sheet, takes the Fed back to a more manageable size, a more serious job. And interestingly...
Okay, so that was a super important point right there, because this seems to get confused all the time when I hear people talking about business, government, and inflation. They say, oh man, well, the Iran war started, oil's gone way up, and so that's inflation. That is not inflation. Okay. Oil and petroleum is in a lot of our products. It affects the supply chain of just about everything. And so when the price of oil goes up, the price of a lot of different other items goes up. But that's still not inflation. Inflation is purely a monetary phenomenon. So what that means is that if you have, like, let's take an example that's a little bit more transparent than oil, because oil is, one of the most complicated supply chains, and the refining process, everything's ridiculously complicated with oil. Let's just talk about an apple orchard. And let's say there's one apple orchard in the whole world. It's up in Washington where they got great apples. And it's 100 acres. And let's say typically they're producing, 10,000 apples. Those apples, they would be expensive, but you might be able to afford one as a delicacy. But then what would happen if there was a disease one year or some drought, and instead of producing 10,000 apples, it only produced 10 apples? The price of those apples would skyrocket. That's supply and demand. You can't point at that and say, well, that's inflation. That's not really inflation. You've got one supply side issue happening there. That is not a monetary phenomenon. That's just the price changing in a market, like what Kevin said right there. And those things happen. There can be issues, going back to the oil example. Wars happen. Wells go dry. All sorts of, there could be shipping issues where a bunch of ships get sunk in a storm, you could say. And then it'd be difficult to ship oil around the world. Well, all those things would cause the price of oil to go up, but that's not inflation. Inflation is when the government prints a ton of money, and then that makes all prices go up. Not perfectly evenly, but relatively uniform. So that's the point he's making there. He's saying, but the way we can kind of temper all that down is by, again, shrinking the Fed's balance sheet. That's the big theme of Kevin Warsh so far, is here we're going to stop printing as much money. And that's going to help when we do have these big shocks where, the price of oil goes way up. It helps to not have systemic inflation built in as well. It helps us absorb those supply side issues.
If you can have a smaller balance sheet, you can have lower interest rates. Back to you.
How much smaller?
So When I joined, the Fed balance sheet was about $880 billion, included a bunch of foreign currencies. We do need some balance sheet to take to do our underlying business, to help run the treasuries, to help be a good counterparty to the rest of the central banks in the world. The economy's obviously grown since then. I wouldn't want to put a precise number on it, but right now the Fed balance sheet is about $7 trillion. They are participating in almost every banking market, almost every day. The world has come to rely on the central bank's massive imprimatur. I would say it is trillions larger than it needs to be. We can't make this change overnight. But if markets knew that our objective was to get to a balance sheet that was as riskless as possible and as small as possible, and we would get there in due time and with a strategy.
So that's why I said that this line right here is what makes me think Kevin Warsh is going to be the best Fed chairman this country's ever had. If he really could shrink the Fed's balance sheet by trillions of dollars, that would be huge. Huge. And he makes the point, it was $880 billion when he was on the board of governors previously, and now it's $7 trillion. So it can be done, and there weren't any problems. You know, again, that was, I think he said that was 20 years ago-ish. No one was thinking, oh my God, the Federal Reserve is really screwing up right now with this $880 billion balance sheet. Things were going just fine. So if he really can't cut it down trillions of dollars, huge success. Yeah, and I love the setup question. It is a good question from the other panel member, but it was a little bit of a setup. He says, how much smaller? He's kind of probing Warsh, wondering if he's going to say, letting him differentiate himself between the end of the Fed guys. Like, he didn't say zero. And that would have been a answer that probably would have derailed his whole campaign to be Fed chairman, which when you think of campaign, he wasn't elected. He was appointed by Trump, but it's more of a backroom campaign, network campaign to get appointed. These people aren't just sitting on their couch wondering if the president's going to appoint them. They're lobbying and having their people lobby on their behalf to become the next chairman. But anyways, that's a whole separate thing here. So if, again, cut it down by trillions, that would be amazing. Really, let's finish it here.
Strategy. I think markets and market participants could well adjust to it. The central bank could then be a powerful central bank, but a more limited one, and I would argue wouldn't find its way in harm's way politically or economically.
Well, there you go. So there you have it. And maybe it's possible he's going to pull a Trump on us or something and say all these things before getting appointed, and then completely stab us in the back and grow the Federal Reserve and all that stuff. That's all possible, as we've been painfully made aware. But what are you going to do? You got to take these people somewhat at their word, and I don't know. I want to believe him. And maybe that's wishful thinking. Maybe it's naivete. But man, I think that he is going to be a good one. I think he genuinely believes it. He's a smart guy. He's really, he was on the board. I think he was like the youngest appointed guy to the board of governors when he was appointed the first time. He spent some time on Wall Street. Incredibly smart guy. Nobody denies he is ridiculously smart. So I really hope that things go well for him and he's able to do his thing. Because remember, there are 8 other members of the board of governors, so he can't just go in there and fully dictate what's happening. He's going to have to work the system and get people on his side. I think Jerome Powell is still going to be on the board too, which is going to be really interesting to have the former chairman there, who he's essentially lambasted, and he's called Jerome Powell out for being a villain and all that kind of stuff. So it'll be really interesting. Probably be kind of awkward for the first meeting, but the Federal Reserve, again, to reiterate, enables our government to borrow cheaply without suffering the consequences. They keep the government's interest rates nice and low. And so what does that do? It encourages more deficit spending. And that's bad, because our Congress would have to be more fiscally responsible if the Federal Reserve wasn't there covering their ass with, and again, as Kevin Warsh pointed out, and I meant to talk about this a little bit more when he said it, but inflation is the most regressive tax you can think of. If you're a leftist sitting here listening to this, And you're like, oh yeah, but big government, come on, let's go. You should be against the Federal Reserve printing all this money, because it's not like the income tax where theoretically it hits richest people the hardest and then tapers down. Rich people do well. They want inflation, and inflation hurts the poorest people. It is, as Kevin Warsh said, the most regressive form of tax you could imagine. So right-wingers shouldn't want a big Federal Reserve. Left-wingers shouldn't want a big, powerful Federal Reserve printing a bunch of money, but the rich want it. So they get, man, it would be a big deal. And it seems like Trump snuck this one past the goalie. Kevin Warsh I don't even think he was in the top 3 on the betting markets to be going to the Federal Reserve. So maybe the lobbying behind the scenes wasn't as tough against Kevin Warsh as the rich may have wanted it to be, now seeing him getting confirmed. So Trump may have, purposefully or not, really stuck one to the elite class right now. And I'm hoping that's true, man. Maybe that's naivete, but I don't think so. I think that Warsh is an honest dude, and we're going to see some really good stuff out of him. So wanted to pivot a little bit now to this 2028 election, because all sorts of weird things are going on. First of all, Thomas Massie has all but declared for the 2028 presidential election, which is huge. He came out and said that he has filed with the FEC, and he is able now to run for any federal office he wants in 2028. So he's staying nimble. Maybe he's going to run for his old seat. Maybe he's going to run for president. I don't know if he can do both, but if he can, he should do both. Make them fight him on 2 fronts. There have been reports that Vance is considering not running, which I think wrong. That's crazy. I mean, he's probably the front runner right now. But he's kind of stuck in the middle here. Kind of what he's got going on is that Marco Rubio is taking the full neocon lane. He's the Secretary of State. He's taking responsibility for all the foreign adventures, good, bad. He's going to take advantage, or he's going to take credit in the 2028 election for the capture of Maduro. He's going to take credit for what we do in Cuba next. And Raul Castro was just indicted in Miami. So you can pretty safely assume that the Trump administration is going to take some kind of military action against Cuba. And Rubio is going to try and wash his hands of the Iran war. But all the other foreign victories he can try and claim, he's going to do it. And then Massie is going to be running in the outside lane, where he's saying, hey, the Trump administration screwed everything up. They promised us doge and they wouldn't give it to us. They said no more wars. All we've gotten is a bunch of foreign wars. Massie's going to take that lane. And Vance is stuck in the middle. And that middle is ever shrinking as the Republican Party gets more and more polarized between the populists and the neocon establishment people, the second factions of the party. So a lot of this dynamic, though, is going to hinge on what happens in 2026, this election in November, how bad it goes for Republicans. Because this whole right-wing civil war that's happened since Trump was elected has only been able to happen because Democrats have been completely shut out. Once they're back, the Democrats, and the right has a common enemy again, I think you're going to see the party coalesce a little more. And unfortunately, I think the party's going to coalesce close, at least all the boomers, the people that vote the most, the 54% that voted for Ed Galbraith, right? They're the ones that are going to coalesce around Donald Trump and either Marco Rubio or Vance to fight the Democrats. Because, like, we haven't been bringing it enough up on the show, again, because they're completely out of power, but the Democrats are still completely insane. You guys got a Tom Steyer ad where he is saying he wants, more transing of the kids, that he wants trans athletes competing in high school sports and blah, 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 all this crap. Once that makes it back into the mainstream and you've got a Democrat-held House and maybe even Democrat-held Senate, the right is going to have to come together to fight that nonsense. Because as much as we dislike the neocons, and we really don't like the neocons here on the populist right, the left is so much worse. They really are. And that's what the neocons kind of rely on. That's their whole pitch is, well, hey, if you want to defeat the people that want to turn your son into a girl, you got to come together. You got to vote for Marco Rubio if that's what you want to fight. I mean, what's the alternative going to be? Gavin Newsom, AOC? You're going to get some communist like Mamdani who's going to seize all your assets and then trans your kids. Like, the choice becomes pretty easy, right? But what we've got to do is pull that away. That 10% difference, I think there is. I think the Massie race was pretty indicative of where the Republican Party's split right now, that 55-45 to the neocon side. But we got to fight for every bit of that, majority that we can bring over to the populist side and get someone like Massie, because all the energy is going to be behind Massie. All the big 80-20 issues, he's on the right side of. He's been against the war in Iran the entire time. He was the guy that released the Epstein files, hugely popular. He's the guy that wants to cut government spending, wants to cut all the fraud. That's him. That's Massie. And Vance is going to try and take some out. Oh man, I ran some blue ribbon committee and we arrested 10 Somalians or something like that. That's what Vance is going to say when I do think he runs. I don't think he's going to bow out or just not run. But Massie wants to tear the entire system down so it can never be exploited again. That's the kind of bold strokes that we need to coalesce around for the populist right. We can't let, some of the populists go towards Vance and then some go towards Massie and then Rubio divides and conquers. That can't be what happens. And I don't think we can just say, oh, well, Vance is going to drop out. We're all going to coalesce around Massie. No, we've got to start doing the work now and say, hey, we're not going to compromise. We're not going to say, oh, but Rubio's a little more electable because Latinos like him better, this or that. We're not going to go with Vance just because he's the middle option and we think that's going to placate MAGA because he's the natural heir as vice president. We got to go with somebody who is not going to stab us in the back again. We got to go with somebody who's not going to go to war for a foreign country. We got to go with somebody who's not just going to reduce the deficit by a couple $1 million. Massie, again, the deficit being how much we go into debt every single year. So if you're reducing the deficit by 50%, you're still adding on to the debt. Massie wants to wipe the entire debt away. Rubio and Vance, they're just going to say, oh, let's reduce the deficit a little bit. Come on. Like with the Trump administration adding so much to the debt, you haven't heard Vance or Rubio say shit. They've just gone right along with it. Massie stood up against it. So that's the guy that we're going to have to coalesce around because he's running. I can already tell you if he's in the race, that's the candidate we're pushing for. But it's gonna get dicey because again, after 2026, I think Democrats are going to take at least one house of the government, and then the neocon right is going to try and sweep all this Iran stuff, all the backstabbing Trump has done under the rug and say, but come on. You really want Gavin Newsom? You really want AOC? Come on, you got to vote for Rubio. You just got to vote. You got to vote for the neocons one more time, and then we can stop the Democrats forever. Which of course not. Voting for Rubio or Vance only stops Democrats in the short term. Voting for Massie, if he wins, he tears down the system for good. It will take them 100 years to build the government back up to the level that it is now for them to continue to exploit us, to cover up the giant rape rings, to, print trillions of dollars for the rich, to bail out the banks, to start new wars. That's what's going to happen if we elect Massie. He's going to tear the whole thing down. Rubio, Vance, not at all. All you're going to get out of them, if one of them does end up becoming president in 2028, you're going to get 4 years of keeping the Democrats out of there. And then the pendulum is going to swing right back the other way, and you're going to have President Mamdani or President AOC. So I'm just calling it right now. That's what's going to happen. They're going to try and make the case after 2020. And it's such a bullshit case anyways, because Rubio and Vance are huge parts of the reason that we're going to lose in 2026. The left is only going to come back to power because the Trump administration is so unpopular. And Rubio and Vance are going right along with it. The Democrats, they're still historically unpopular, and they're going to win an election because Trump was also historically unpopular. So this whole thing, that's my prediction. 2026 comes, Democrats take at least the House, and then the neocons hit us again with it. But come on, man. Come on, just one more time. Just one more war in Iraq. Come on, just one more Middle Eastern country we gotta go topple, and then everything will be fine. Just don't ask any more questions. Just let us keep printing. Just another $5 trillion, and then everything will be fine. No, fuck those guys. We will never root for them in any kind of primary again. So that's an episode, guys. Later.